Hey everybody, this is Dr. McDonald, and I wanted to put together an audio and video presentation using a new technology. This is called Debut, so it allows me to put together both a PowerPoint and an audio recording. And this is specifically going to cover the early Indian policy after the Constitution and with President Washington and his Secretary of War, Henry Knox. We're going to see a number of questions being addressed in the 1780s and 1790s. Again, these audio lectures are a way to augment some of the material that is already in the textbook, but I like to, again, go into some more detail about some of these issues. And this is a fascinating story that often gets pushed to the side because of many other matters that the early government was dealing with. Relations with Great Britain after the American Revolution, Hamilton's financial policy, the French Revolution, some of which you're probably familiar with. But Washington and his Secretary of War clearly made this a priority from 1789 and afterwards. A lot of it has to do with the fact that they're trying to create a legacy for the United States, and specifically to do Indian policy and to carry it out differently than other colonial powers might. There was a sense that the United States was different ever since its creation, and that other nations, when they were territories where they expanded in war or conquest, how would they integrate those new areas? We saw some of this played out in the textbook with a discussion of the Land Act and the Northwest Ordinance. What was unique about the Northwest Ordinance was the idea that new territories would be brought in to the United States through a process, and when they became new states, they would not suffer because they were newer territories. In other words, for example, when Ohio becomes a state, they would still get all the rights and privileges of the older states, even though those older territories may have dated back to the time of the colonies in the 1600s. As your textbook correctly points out, this was something of a pretty unique innovation. There was no penalty, in other words, because the territories that the United States acquired at the end of the American Revolution would be brought in to the overall continental United States, which at the time expanded to the Mississippi River. There were new neighbors for the United States, including across the Mississippi River, the nation of Spain, to the north, of course. You see on the map, Great Britain controlling Canada. And the post-war boundaries of 1783, we see a number of different European continental powers that still had claims to North America. Also is substantial that there is significant Native American populations. So we're going to figure out a number of questions in this audio presentation. Some of them were controversies throughout the 1780s when the government during the American Revolution was, for the most part, very weak, the federal government, and that was done on purpose. It was done because they didn't want to give the national government the kind of power that it might abuse. Now, they had seen that happen with Great Britain, one of the main causes of the American Revolution. But at the end of the 1780s, when the Constitutional Convention was called, there was certainly a desire to at least fix the shortcomings of the first Constitution, which was called the Articles of Confederation. And so that Confederation Congress that met during the war and through most of the 1780s before the newer Constitution was written, had an often confusing policy. Now, you saw in the textbook that there were Western land claims. To give you an example, New England states would claim areas of Michigan. A kind of ridiculous idea when you think about it, but it all goes back to the time when then these states were colonies and they didn't have well-defined borders. For example, Virginia didn't even have a western border when it was originally drawn up in England in the early 1600s. So we'll talk a little bit about that policy as we go along and use some slides that I put together to try to give you some video orientation. After the American Revolution, of course, we see two very important pieces of legislation passed by the Confederation Congress. The Land Act began to organize in 1785 a method for surveying and selling land. Secondly, the Northwest Ordinance. Among other things, it would set up the grid system for the township. It banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, which is above the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi, from which a number of states would be carved out after 1800. Now, when Washington comes into office in 1789, he has a number of issues to deal with, both foreign and domestic. How do you raise revenue for the United States? That we are no longer colonies of Great Britain. Well, that puts us in a unique economic and political situation. But he's also looking at what's happening in the West. He wants to make sure that settlement in the West is orderly. This goes back to a time when the British were also trying to contain their colonists from moving west across the Proclamation Act of 1763. But Great Britain is gone. They're no longer the mother country. And the colonies have to carve their own policy. Many people didn't think the United States, this form of a republic, a principle where people are elected to make choices for you, an executive, an office of president that was not clearly defined about what he could do just yet. And of course, if the states weren't going to deal with this issue, if the federal government would pick that up, would they have the right to carry out policy, setting up the West and dealing with Native Americans, a substantial population? 100,000 Indians live in the Trans-Appalachian West. Immediately after the American Revolution, there are thousands of people moving across the mountains. Not surprisingly, they believe that they had been the victors in the American Revolution. The English had tried to contain them on the eastern side of the mountains with the Proclamation Line. With England gone, they believed the fruits of their victory were to cross the mountains and to go into areas in the West, Tennessee, Kentucky. Those territories were organized in the 1790s. Beyond the Ohio Valley, west of what's now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, into areas of western Georgia and the Alabama Territory. All of this came up as an issue for President Washington. Many squatters arrived, meaning they live on the land without any formal legal title. Can they remain there? Of course, this went right up against the Indian settlement line. This was an issue for President Washington. Many Americans who crossed into the West in the 1780s and 90s believed that Native Americans were one of the other losers in the American Revolution. Most Indian nations, with few exceptions, had actually sided with Great Britain, not surprisingly, against this upstart United States. So it was their right of victory, many colonists and now settlers and Americans thought, to cross into Indian lands. I put on the outline some of the names of the Indian nations that colonists and now settlers in the United States, folks who lived on the frontier, would be dealing with. The Delaware Indians, very prominent in what is now Pennsylvania and Ohio. The Wyandot, the Miami, the Ottawa, the Chippewa, and the Shawnee. There was an expectation among whites that many Indians would have to become to live farmers, live like them, in other words. And it was an overall idea that remained part of American policy for most of the 1700s and into the 1800s. There was a belief that since Native Americans did not use the land to farm the same way as whites, it was their right to take it. If they don't use it the way we want for commercial agriculture, many believed, well, why should they have an actual right to it? So this is the dilemma for President Washington in 1789 and 1790. During the Confederation period, and usually that is considered the end of the Revolution, 1783 until 1789, when the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were passed. There are two examples of policies put in place by Congress, and they usually had treaties from the national government to different Native American groups. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix, for example, in 1784, signed a treaty with the Iroquois Nation, who were largely in New York, but also had some control over Indians, the Miami and Delaware, for example, in Pennsylvania. We also have the example of the Treaty of Hopewell in 1785 and 1786, dealing with the Cherokee Indians in the South. That had to do with moving Indians near the Georgia and North Carolina border at the end of American Revolution. Treaty of Fort Stanwix did force the Iroquois to give up lands in New York. The Iroquois were Six Nations, and they had fought against American independence, had sided with the British, not surprisingly, because, as far as they were concerned, a British victory would mean more respect of keeping colonists and Indians apart and preventing any kind of conflict, bloodshed, or having to surrender more of their own land. That made perfect sense in some ways. So one of the issues as the new government went into effect, and that's another overall theme of the late 1780s, we weren't clearly sure about what the government could do and could not do, the power of Congress. Would Native Americans be treated as a foreign nation? In other words, would you negotiate with Indian nations as you would the French or the Dutch or the English? And that was not quite ironed out yet by the 1780s. So George Washington, president from 1789 to 1797, is at the end of the day faced with three choices. And he's very much conscious of how these decisions will affect presidents and Congress and cabinet members in the future. Washington has the unenviable task of being the first president, and that means that people are watching his behavior, and the principles that he sets for the office and the limits for the presidency and the executive branch will be, he believes, copied in many ways if they are sound, good principles. So he tries to put the best people around him and tries to come up with policies that he believes are best for the nation. He has three main choices in office when dealing with Native American policy. One is war. By force, remove Native Americans from areas of the Northwest and areas of the Southwest. Problem with that, of course, is that it will be bloody, it will be very costly, and it doesn't seem to usher in a new chapter in how this new nation, the United States, will deal with Native Americans in the West. And he wants to break from the patterns of old, break from the European model. The second would be simply conquest, moving in sheer numbers, as many had argued, by force of numbers, the Indians, and not necessarily going to war, but push off their lands, limit their hunting ground, and move them across the Mississippi River. The right of conquest seemed to be for many a logical alternative to out-and-out conflict and sustained war. The third idea would be possibly purchase. Those are the three options that Washington had. Washington is president, and his Secretary of War, Henry Knox. And again, that cabinet position has the title, and for most of American history, it was called the Secretary of War until it became known as the Secretary of Defense, and that happened in the 1940s after World War II. Henry Knox was General George Washington's artillery commander during the American Revolution. He's a self-taught New Englander who is very conscious, as Washington, of the early decisions made on Indian policy. And you might think this is unusual. Whose prerogative? Whose turf, in other words, as far as the cabinets, and the cabinet was quite smaller back then, who gets to dictate and lead Indian policy? You might think, if we are to treat Native Americans like foreign nations, dependent nations in this case, that live amongst and within the United States, it might be the Secretary of State. The man who held that position, of course, was Thomas Jefferson, the first Secretary of State, but he was still in Europe, serving as the first American minister to France. So not wanting to delay, not wanting to wait for Jefferson, Knox did a lot of research and presented a history to Washington about how treaties were done going back to the colonial period and the 1780s, including the two that I mentioned, the Treaty of Hopewell and the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. The other star of this story, if we're talking about a cast of characters, is a man who's half Creek, half white, Alexander McGillivray, who is a leader of the Creek Nation, a nation that in many ways is similar to the Iroquois because they can have a lot of weight and their nation can make decisions based on a lot of territory in the American Southwest. So, those are the controversies at stake in the 1780s. Who controls this policy, the states or the national government? Will you treat Native Americans as a dependent nation? What are the options to move onto land that you know settlers and pioneers and traders will move to in the 1780s? And of course, if the executive branch, the president, would start this policy, how would you then pass any treaties? Well, the treaty-making power was typically split up between the executive branch and the legislative in the form of the Senate. The Senate gave advice and consent to any treaties. Those were words that were a little bit vague. What did advise and consent mean? And so this was all new ground to test out in the 1780s. Washington had to ask himself, should I directly go to the Senate and speak personally, or should I simply submit the treaty? Again, he wasn't quite sure. But he knew one thing. He said, quote, "The honor on the new government," unquote, declares that the Indians have the land. That much is clear. He also knew that posterity, meaning future generations, would look and make note of what was done in the early Native American policy. He also has in his ally, Secretary Knox, someone who understands Washington very much. He can appeal to Washington's sense of doing the right thing, his sense of honor, and how he's very concerned, is Washington, with his reputation, not only personal reputation, but reputation of the country early on. So Knox is effectively approaching Washington looking for a reversal of Indian policy. They don't want the conquest. They don't want to simply play the numbers game. It is Knox who reviews all of the United States Indian policies of the 1780s and says, we need to change them. And we also should make these policies binding upon the states. Knox goes back before his time as a first Secretary of War. He'd actually held that position under the old Constitution. So previous to Washington being elected the first president, Knox effectively had been the Secretary of War for Congress. And so we've got someone who has experience in these matters. He knows, Knox is very familiar with the idea that many of these policies had been violated by the individual states. So he wants a binding policy that's set up by the national government. Knox is also very much concerned with the fact, and gives the numbers to George Washington as Secretary of War. A sustained Indian conflict, fighting by military force, would cost the United States $15 million a year. Back then, that was a lot of money. That was a considerable part of the entire United States budget. And it was not sustainable, in other words, Knox concluded. So that eliminated the war option, they thought. And this was going to dictate their policy after 1790. It shows us that in the middle of all these other large issues where Washington was putting together the first executive branch, dealing with Hamilton's financial program. Can Congress create a bank? Other such questions of foreign policy. This very much was on his mind. So what Washington was suggesting, along with Knox, should be given his due credit for organizing this first policy, is that coercion had to be replaced. And it had to be replaced by mutual consent. That was the idea of the treaty in 1789. That's what brings McGillivray, Knox, Washington, and other Native American leaders to the bargaining that took place in New York City in 1790. This would serve as a test case. The Creek Indians controlled territory from Florida to the Mississippi and Georgia. As I said earlier, they are something along the lines of the southern version of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Six Nations of New York State that did have some political might beyond simply New York, the state. It is the Creek who can exact influence on their neighbors, including the Choctaw and Chickasaw of the American Southwest. So the plan, looking beyond the time of the 1790s, and I'll use the map again to demonstrate what I'm talking about. There were areas that were claimed by Great Britain and Spain and the United States, and they had not fully worked out the borders. Where did the United States end in the Southwest? Now, at the time, Spain had reclaimed both parts of Florida, East Florida, and of course here, the peninsula. And the peninsula would include present-day Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana up to New Orleans. But there were regions in the southwest of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi that both nations claimed. There was also hope that the United States would later, again, after treaties with the Spanish and the British, end up controlling both Pensacola and the panhandle of Florida and replacing the Spanish in New Orleans. But they just would decide to wait and again play the numbers game. They knew especially that the Spanish claim in the Southwest was very weak. They weren't going to force the issue by conflict or war. They'd simply wait. Spain's best days, they believed, were actually behind them. So Washington and Knox enter the Senate in August of 1789, and their overall experience was not very good. They found the Senate was very much a glorified debating society. They weren't moving with the speed that Washington and Knox wanted, and the Senate ended up approving a commission to start treaty negotiations. More critically, and what needed to be recognized by Washington and Knox as they pushed forward this attempted treaty with the Creek, the test case for other ideas of Indian homelands, where Native Americans would remain on their ancestral land and settlers would move around them, maybe even later on integrating those Indian territories into states as they learned to adopt ways of whites. That was the hope. Now, was it too much to expect? Possibly, especially from the point of view of those squatters and settlers. Washington at some point said that I could build a Chinese wall, meaning he's referring to the Great Wall of China, to separate the settlers from the Indians, and that would not stop. I could literally put a line of troops like the Great Wall of China in the West, and that would not stop people from moving over the divide and keeping conflicts to a minimum. What sped up the process for Washington and Knox were events that took place in Georgia. In 1790, the Georgia legislature sold 24 million acres to a private company called the Yazoo Company. And that would include parts of Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. The reason they thought they were able to do that is that the legislature, again, received a lot of bribes from individual investors. People recognize outside of Georgia that this land sale was something of a joke. But those who sold the land to this private Yazoo company, who would then, of course, sell it for huge profits, argued that the original Georgia colony, going back to when it was created by the British in the 1730s, the original boundaries of the colony of Georgia included this land, and that, as the legislature claimed, gave them the right to sell this individual land company. Also, there was talk in the Georgia legislature that if the Indians did not, in other words, play ball, and they specifically called out Alexander McGillivray, they would try to bribe him. If they could not bribe him, they mentioned the idea of possibly placing a contract on McGillivray to have him killed. Shocking kind of course of events when you think about it. But after the go-ahead was given by the U.S. Senate to pursue this new policy of a treaty, there was a summit meeting held in New York, and McGillivray, for the first time, would be able to move some of his fellow Native Americans for the meeting to New York. New York early on was the first capital of the United States before, of course, it moved for a decade to Philadelphia after 1791, and then, of course, to the banks of the Potomac in between Maryland and Virginia, later called Washington, D.C. So Washington was inaugurated in New York City in 1789, and again, it was, at the time, one of America's largest cities, and it was done on purpose to impress McGillivray and the Creeks. He took a 700-mile trip in May of 1790, making many stops along the way. And Washington and company, the cabinet, the Congress, pulled out all the stops. Why not, they thought, see America's most impressive port city, New York, Lower Manhattan? Only a portion of the island was occupied by any folks. It hadn't moved all the way up to Manhattan Island. There was huge press coverage. It was something of a sensation to have McGillivray and some of his fellow Indians make the trip to New York City and sit down with members of the cabinet and Washington. It was done on purpose. It was done because Washington and company wanted to make sure that McGillivray and the Creeks recognized that the United States was an economic and political power. To them, it might have seemed like that. To other parts of the world, still very much a newly independent set of colonies. So this was a way to convey, in some ways, maybe the seriousness of Washington's effort. Later in 1790, Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, actually joined the group. And he would argue, as others did, that the legislature of Georgia that sold this land to the Yazoo Company had done something that was illegal. But the ultimate test would be whether or not the treaty, once one was worked out in New York, a treaty by the national government, was actually seen as binding to the other parts affected by whatever decisions were made for and between the United States and the Creeks. In August of 1790, the Treaty of New York, as it was called, was signed. It gave the Creeks title to land, western Georgia, Alabama, and eastern Mississippi. Although the borders were somewhat unclear, it did at least organize and recognize and became one of the first important treaties for the United States. The Creeks also, this would be part of Washington and Knox's plan. There would be recognition of land by the Creek Indians and also a payment. $60,000 a year in trading goods would be provided by the United States government, which at the time seemed a rather princely sum, but as Knox and Washington could argue, that was quite a bit cheaper than continuing a conflict with Native Americans. Also, as part of this treaty in 1790, the United States authorized a commission for Alexander McGillivray to receive $1,200 a year as salary as Brigadier General. This had been done going back to colonial times. Different colonies and even the British and now the United States would give honorary military titles in the form of being an officer to trusted Native American leaders. It would give them, of course, the ability to say that they were recognized by the United States. Unfortunately, in the aftermath of the treaty in New York in 1790, the Georgia settlers totally ignored the treaty. They poured into Creek lands starting in 1790. Knox, Secretary of War, began to send soldiers. The United States Army in 1790 was very small, probably less than 4,000 soldiers. We had no Navy as created yet, and many of the American Army, the regular Army, was and had been deployed to the American Northwest, where it was actually having trouble with a very well organized group of Native Americans in the borders between Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, a story that we'll tell later on. Knox told Washington that sending these soldiers was like stopping a flood with sponges. It just wasn't going to work. The Georgia legislature had made their decision, and the settlers began, in violation of the Treaty of 1790. That treaty should have been binding. It was a federal treaty. The Georgia legislature, and more importantly, Westerners ignored it. George Washington ended up calling the group moving into the Creek lands, quote, a lawless set of unprincipled wretches who were not receiving any punishment, unquote. Unable to stop the treaty that they had passed with McGillivray and the Creeks, it shouldn't surprise us that Alexander McGillivray eventually flees his allegiance and abandons the United States and his brigadier general title and makes his way towards the Spanish in Florida and areas west. They decide, the Spanish, to pay him a salary of $2,000 a year. To Spain, operating out of the two parts of Florida, they would be better off antagonizing the United States against the Creek and Creek allied Indians. And that would have, in fact, as we can see their grand policy on this slide, that would in fact contain the American settlers and keep them out of areas of what's now Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. So that was a part of the Spanish goal in lieu of the Treaty of 1790. 2 years after the treaty, it's clear that it had all been undone. The Yazoo Land Company had preempted in some ways the federal government. McGillivray dies in 1793, and there are continued problems of Spanish incursions, and the Spanish continuing to, of course, encourage Native Americans and the Creeks to attack American settlers. Not surprisingly, because this Treaty of 1790 was supposed to prevent this from happening. This was Washington's attempt to create a new type of policy. And it would be a policy that would reflect, he thought, well on the new United States. It would show that the nation was going to conduct its policy differently than Europeans. Or it would also assert the power of the federal government over the states. That was a relationship that people weren't exactly sure about. The states would be given some power in the Constitution of 1788, but there was a lot unknown. What powers could the federal government assume? What was the power of the executive branch versus the legislature? So what we'll do next time, I want to give you a short introduction about the olive branch attempt. And these lectures are clearly about the two alternatives Washington faced, and unfortunately the two he had to engage in. The attempted olive branch dealing with McGillivray, the Creeks, and the Treaty of New York, and what was taking place at the same time in the Northwest Territory, where successive American armies were going into the area to try to keep the peace, but finding that in the end, largely unsuccessful. So we'll outline that part of the American policy in the Northwest next time.